Welcome to our deep dive into something we're calling algorithmic complacency. It's a fascinating look at how algorithms are shaping our world, and more importantly, what we can do about it. We'll be drawing from some expert opinions and real-world examples. We even have a touch of psychological research. All of this is to help you understand how these algorithms might be subtly influencing you, and how to navigate the digital landscape a little more mindfully.
Yeah, it's true. We often don't even realize the extent to which algorithms influence our online experiences. We've become so accustomed to them curating our feeds that we sort of forget that they're not neutral entities.
It's a far cry from the early days of the internet, right? Remember when we used to dial up and manually search for information? It was a slower, more intentional process. Now it feels like we're constantly bombarded with content, and it's hard to know what's genuinely relevant or just designed to keep us scrolling.
Yeah, that's a key point. Algorithms are designed to keep us engaged. And that's not always in our best interest. Platforms like YouTube and social media and news aggregators, they use sophisticated algorithms to analyze our every click, like, and comment. They're creating this detailed digital profile that predicts what will keep us hooked.
So it's not just about convenience. It's about profit. The longer we stay engaged, the more ads we see and the more revenue these platforms generate.
Precisely. And here's where things get a little unsettling. Research suggests that algorithms often prioritize content that triggers strong emotions, particularly negative ones like anger, outrage, and fear, because those emotions tend to keep us glued to our screens.
Hold on. So even if something is potentially harmful, like misinformation or divisive content, the algorithm might still push it because it knows it will trigger a reaction. That seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't platforms want to promote positive and accurate information?
Well, it's not about what's best for us. It's about what keeps us engaged. The more we react even negatively, the more data we provide. And the better these algorithms become at predicting what will keep us coming back for more. So it creates this kind of feedback loop where we're constantly bombarded with content designed to provoke a response, regardless of its accuracy or overall impact.
It makes you wonder if we're losing some essential skills in this process. There was a fascinating example in one of the videos we watched from Technology Connections, where the host showed an image of a vintage Silvertone radio, and he challenged viewers to identify various details. And it made me realize that maybe we're becoming a bit too reliant on algorithms to do the thinking for us.
Yeah, that's a great example of what we might call algorithmic complacency. As we become more accustomed to algorithms curating our experiences, we may be losing some of the critical thinking and research skills that were once essential to navigating the online world.
He went on to share a statistic that really struck me. Only 3% of views on his channel came from the subscription feed. That means most people are discovering his content through recommendations, rather than actively choosing to see it.
Yeah, that's a potential symptom of this algorithmic complacency. We're becoming so accustomed to letting algorithms decide what we see, that we may be losing sight of the power we have to curate our own online experiences intentionally.
So it's not just about being aware of how algorithms work, but also about understanding how they might be subtly influencing our perceptions and behavior.
Exactly. And this influence can have real-world consequences, from increasing polarization and spreading misinformation to impacting our mental health and relationships.
I think that's a great place to pause. We've explored how algorithms are designed and the potential downsides of algorithmic complacency. In Part 2, we'll delve deeper into the psychological mechanisms at play and discuss the impact on our well-being. Welcome back to our deep dive into algorithmic complacency. So far, we've been unpacking how these algorithms work and the potential pitfalls of letting them just dictate our online experience.
And as we've seen, these algorithms aren't just tools. They're designed to keep us engaged, often by tapping into our deepest psychological vulnerabilities.
You mentioned earlier that algorithms often prioritize content that triggers strong emotions, especially negative ones. Let's unpack that a bit. What's the psychology behind that?
Well, it's not exactly a secret that humans are drawn to drama and conflict. It's wired into our brains. Our ancestors had to be vigilant to threats. And that instinct still influences us today, even in the digital realm.
So you're saying we're hardwired to pay attention to negative information?
Exactly. It's called negativity bias. And it explains why we tend to remember negative experiences more vividly than positive ones. And social media platforms know this. Their algorithms are designed to exploit this bias, feeding us a steady stream of content that triggers those primal fight or flight responses.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that make us want to avoid those platforms? Who wants to feel stressed and anxious all the time?
That's where the brain's reward system comes in. When we see something that triggers a strong emotional response, our brains release dopamine, a neurochemical associated with pleasure and motivation.
So it's like a reward for getting riled up.
In a way, yes. And the more we engage with that type of content, the more our brains crave those dopamine hits, creating a kind of addiction.
That sounds a lot like the mechanics of gambling addiction. You get a rush from the possibility of winning, even though the odds are stacked against you.
Exactly. And social media platforms are masters at creating that same feeling of anticipation and reward. Every notification, every comment triggers a little burst of dopamine, keeping us hooked on the possibility of the next hit.
So we're essentially being trained to crave those digital rewards, even if they're ultimately hollow and unsatisfying.
Precisely. And this constant need to check for notifications, to compare ourselves to others, to seek validation from strangers, it can have a significant impact on our mental health and well-being.
We've all heard about the link between social media and things like anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. But it's easy to dismiss that as just another moral panic. But what you're describing sounds more insidious. It's almost like we're being subtly manipulated into unhealthy behaviors.
I wouldn't say manipulated, but it's definitely a form of persuasion. These platforms are incredibly sophisticated at using our own psychology against us, creating environments that encourage addiction and dependence.
Earlier, we talked about how algorithmic complacency might be making us less resourceful. We're so used to having information served to us that we might be losing the skills to seek it out on our own. I'm wondering if there's a similar erosion happening in our social skills.
That's a great point. Social media platforms often promote a very curated and filtered version of reality. We see highlight reels, not the behind-the-scenes messiness of real life. This can create unrealistic expectations and make it harder to connect with others authentically.
And then there's the issue of context collapse, which we touched on earlier. Can you remind us what that is and how it relates to algorithms?
Sure, imagine you're overhearing a conversation in a restaurant. You might catch a snippet that sounds interesting, but you wouldn't just jump into the conversation without understanding the context. In real-life interactions, we have social cues and norms that guide our behavior, but online, those boundaries are often blurred.
Because algorithms don't care about context.
Exactly. They prioritize engagement, not understanding. So you might see a post from someone you barely know taken out of context and feel compelled to react even if you don't fully grasp the nuances of the situation.
And that can lead to misunderstandings, arguments, and a general sense of disconnect.
Precisely. It's like we're constantly stumbling into conversations we weren't invited to, without the social skills to navigate those interactions effectively.
So we're becoming both more connected and more isolated at the same time.
It's one of the great paradoxes of the digital age. We have access to more people than ever before, but those connections are often superficial and fleeting. And meanwhile, our real-world relationships might be suffering as we spend more and more time glued to our screens, chasing those dopamine hits.
It's a sobering thought. But before we spiral into despair, let's shift gears a bit. In Part 3, we'll explore some strategies for regaining control over our online experience and discuss the possibility of a more balanced and humane digital future. Welcome back to our deep dive into algorithmic complacency. In Parts 1 and 2, we've explored the inner workings of these algorithms and how they might be impacting us on a psychological level. It's been a fascinating, albeit somewhat unsettling journey so far.
Yeah, it's true. There are some concerning aspects to consider, but it's not all doom and gloom. Awareness is the first step towards change. And the fact that we're having this conversation is a positive sign.
So you're saying there's hope. We're not just destined to become slaves to these algorithms.
Definitely not. Remember, these platforms are ultimately reliant on users. If enough people demand change, they'll have to adapt.
That's encouraging. But where do we even begin? It can feel overwhelming to think about challenging these massive tech giants. They seem to have so much power and influence.
It's true they wield considerable power, but they're not invincible. I think we're already seeing a shift in the conversation. People are becoming more aware of the potential downsides of these technologies, and there's a growing movement pushing for greater transparency and ethical design.
So it's not just about individual choices. It's about collective action and systemic change.
Exactly. We need regulations that hold these platforms accountable for the impact they're having on society. And we need to support organizations and individuals who are fighting for digital rights and ethical tech.
There's been some talk about regulating algorithms. But how do you even begin to regulate something as complex and ever-evolving as artificial intelligence?
It's a daunting task, but not impossible. Some countries are already taking steps in the right direction. The European Union, for example, recently passed laws guaranteeing people the right to opt out of algorithmic curation.
That's interesting. So instead of letting the algorithm decide what you see, you can choose to see content in chronological order or based on other criteria.
Exactly. It's about giving users more control over their online experience. And there are other approaches being explored, such as requiring platforms to disclose how their algorithms work, and providing users with tools to customize their feeds.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, what can we do as individuals to regain some control over our digital lives?
Well, we've touched on some practical strategies already. Setting time limits on app usage, curating your feed by unfollowing accounts that trigger negative emotions, diversifying your information sources by seeking out reputable news and perspectives outside of social media. Those are all great first steps.
It's also about being mindful of our emotional state, right? Recognizing when we're feeling triggered or overwhelmed and stepping away from those platforms.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that you have the power to choose how you engage with these technologies. You don't have to be a passive consumer. You can actively shape your online experience to align with your values and priorities.
Earlier, you mentioned that platforms often exploit our psychological vulnerabilities to keep us engaged. What can we do to become more resilient to those tactics?
Well, becoming aware of those tactics is a crucial first step. Understanding how negativity bias and the reward system work can help you recognize when you're being manipulated. And remember, those dopamine hits are fleeting. They don't provide lasting satisfaction. Finding joy and fulfillment in real-world experiences is essential for well-being.
So it's about finding that balance between the digital and the real.
Exactly. Cultivating meaningful relationships, pursuing hobbies and interests, spending time in nature. These are all things that can nourish your soul in a way that social media simply can't.
It seems like this all comes down to mindfulness, being present in our lives, both online and offline, and making conscious choices about how we spend our time and energy.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. There will be times when you get sucked into the vortex of social media, and that's okay. The key is to notice those patterns and gently redirect your attention back to what truly matters.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the technical intricacies of algorithms to the psychological impact on our well-being. But ultimately, it's a message of hope and empowerment.
I think so. We have more power than we realize to shape our digital future. By becoming aware of how these technologies work, making conscious choices about how we engage with them, and advocating for change, we can create a digital world that serves humanity, not the other way around.
That's an inspiring thought to end on. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into algorithmic complacency. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. The future of our digital lives depends on it.